Continuing with the last of my planned reviews before calling it quits on making TSW videos, we now turn to something very different from the normal UK, US and Germany trio. This is an overview of, and my 2 cents on, the Liberec to Stará Paka route, notable for being the first time we've seen the Czech Republic, or Czechia, in TSW. Apologies in advance if I butcher the pronunciation of the place names, but I'll do my best. For reference, I have at least 2 reviews left in the pipeline after this one, namely the North London line, once the Richmond extension is released, and whatever gets announced as the core UK route for TSW7. Maybe WCML Trent Valley at some point as well, but I cannot stress enough just how maybe that idea is.
Dámy a pánové, následuje stanice Semily.
Liberec to Stará Paka is the first add-on developed by Vector Simulations, and one of numerous add-ons that Dovetail released stupidly close together throughout March 2026. I initially held off from buying the route because, historically, Czech railways have never been my cup of tea, and, of course, the add-on's high price was another contributing factor. I am of the opinion that $64.49 NZD, or £33 or 40 euros, is far too much to pay for a single TSW add-on, regardless of how good it may be. In the end, I waited until I could get the Czech route at a discount. Such an opportunity came about sooner than expected, during a railway-themed sale that Steam were putting on in late July 2026, so I was able to get the route for 25% off, and paid a more reasonable $48.36 NZD, or around £21 or 24 euros. The railway line from Liberec to Stará Paka is 75 kilometres, or around 46 miles long, and runs on a northwest to southeast axis, with Liberec at the northern end and Stará Paka at the southern end. It's a mostly single-track line running through difficult mountainous terrain, and is thus reminiscent of the Mittenwaldbahn, albeit with less severe inclines and no electrification. As for motive power, the Czech route includes the České dráhy Class 843 diesel railcar for passenger services, and the Class 750 diesel locomotive for freight services. However, the České dráhy branding doesn't appear in-game by default due to licensing restrictions, but PC players can get a mod from the TrainSim community website that adds the missing branding. And now, it's time for the musical 843. In case you couldn't tell, that was an attempt at playing the guitar riff from David Bowie's Rebel Rebel. I reckon that's a pretty good example of a riff-driven song, if ever there was one. There are tutorial scenarios included for both the 843 and 750, covering the general introduction and both an interior and exterior walkaround, so I would consider it important to play through said tutorials if you're unfamiliar with this motive power, which, I dare say, will be the case for a sizable number of people, myself included. For reference, the tutorials are not in the standard training modules menu. Instead, they are buried in the journey mode thing, which is found in the Rail Journeys menu. Ordinarily, I don't go through the tutorial scenarios, but I made an exception this time due to the Czech motive power being entirely unfamiliar territory. It's worth mentioning that there's a third tutorial for the Class 750, and that one apparently focuses on banking operations. The last time I remember seeing a TSW route with the opportunity for banking another train was the Peak Forest add-on of 2023. Meanwhile, the Liberec to Stará Paka add-on also comes with 9 scenarios, 3 for the Class 750 and 6 for the Class 843. The scenarios range in duration from 40 to 120 minutes, and to be honest, I was put off from playing the really long scenarios. I will give Vector Simulations credit for how they made a well-detailed 63-page manual for this route, which I would highly recommend reading. It's got details on how to prepare the 843 and 750 from cold, as well as how to set up the cab to start driving and even how to change cabs, not to mention details about the all-new signalling and safety systems, neither of which I understand. Incidentally, while I may be of the opinion that the 750 is not much of a looker, I will say that I like the sound of her prime mover. It kind of reminds me of the British Rail Class 40, despite being really hard to hear amongst all the other noise. The 843 has a bizarre throttle setup that reminds me of the Deutsche Bahn BR612 diesel multiple unit. There aren't any conventional notches on the 843's combined throttle and brake lever. Instead, there's a position labelled as J just below the one that actually applies power, and you'll have to set the lever forward to S. Then you can spring it back to J once you've reached the desired power level, and set it to V when you want to reduce power. The lever works the same sort of way for the electrodynamic brake, and for this, you'll need to hold it in the BE position, then it'll spring back to V when you let go of the lever. Annoyingly, the lever won't move into the BP setting when you're just using the keyboard command. You'll have to use the mouse click to move the throttle lever past BE. It's safe to say that the 843's throttle and braking setup will take some getting used to before it makes sense. While driving or otherwise observing the 843 in her default state, I noticed that she has very loud traction motors that drown out the prime mover sound, but that appears to be accurate, if footage of the real thing is anything to go by. In any case, I noticed that, at both ends, this railcar has a cab door on only one side, which reminds me of the GE 4/4 Mark II locomotive on the Arosa line. One last thing before moving on to the 750. I see that there's a mod on the TrainSim community website that lowers the 843's traction motor volume. Meanwhile, the 750 has a more conventional setup in the sense that she at least has a separate train brake lever, although this lever has a smooth range rather than conventional notches, while the throttle looks like the steering wheel from a car or some other form of road vehicle. I like how the spoke lines up with the red numbers that represent power notches. Although I am of the opinion that the 750 is ugly, I have no ill will towards those who do like this locomotive. She kind of reminds me of the old Soviet-era diesel locomotives. To be fair to the 750, one thing I particularly like on this thing is her fully detailed and accessible machine room. Something that I wish was a more common feature on diesels with full-width bodies that we've got in TSW. Walking through the 750's machine room reminded me of the time when I got to have a look in the machine room aboard a DG locomotive here in New Zealand. For reference, the DG is at least 7 years older than the 750, having been built in the mid-1950s, as opposed to somewhere between 1968 and 1977. Back in the 750, I noticed that the driver's seat will slide to one side when you open the electric compartment door or the cab side door. And I don't know about you, but personally, I can't help thinking that the 750's cab interior feels quite cramped, much like the DG now that I think about it. Timetable mode features 59 playable services for the Class 843 and 44 for the Class 750. Well, it's more like only 11 services for the 750 because nearly all of them are split into multiple parts, but to be fair, that does allow for shorter gameplay sessions if that's what people prefer. I noticed that most of the freight services run early in the morning or late at night, with almost nothing through the middle of the day. When I drove the 750, I got the sense that this locomotive has a lot of weight to her, even without a train in tow. Freight services in TSW are generally not my cup of tea, but it's still good to see them on this route, even if just because they add variety to the rail scene. However, one thing that annoys me when I'm driving a 750 is how the driver assist always pops up to remind you to set the brakes back to release after going to quick release, and I don't know if you can turn off the driver assist malarkey. Meanwhile, the throttle wheel is quite heavy, and makes a prominent clunk when you move it from one notch to the next. As one might expect, the 750 is very slow off the mark with a train in tow. Meanwhile, when it comes to passenger services covering the full route, the 843 only has 17 services in each direction throughout the day, with most of the rest being empty stock movements. At one point, I also caught an 843 running around a pair of coaches at Liberec, then taking them away. This practice of a railcar hauling coaches is something I don't recall seeing in any previous TSW route, apart from the Bernina line, but I haven't got that one, and will not buy it unless the coverage is ever extended to St. Moritz. Anyway, one of the 843's services out of Stará Paka is a bit odd, in the sense that it's not labelled as being a multi-parter, but it effectively is due to being split at Železný Brod and Turnov. I have no idea what's going on with this particular service. In any case, it's safe to say that life on this line moves at a more relaxed pace than the likes of the Frankfurt S-Bahn or Brighton Main Line. Even with the 843 and a couple of coaches, driving along this route can be difficult given the combination of steep grades, sometimes as steep as 1 in 60, and that unusual throttle and braking setup. On that note, I feel that the electrodynamic brake is a bit weak for my liking, to the point where I prefer to use the direct brake instead when I'm slowing down to stop at a station. The matter of brakes aside, it's nice to watch the scenery unfold ahead of you as you go up or down the hills and round the bends. Yes, that was an engine roll call reference, even though I dislike the hit era of Thomas in general, and that blasted song in particular. Anyway, average speeds on the Liberec to Stará Paka line are higher than I was expecting, with speed limits for passenger services generally between 70 and 100 km per hour, while freight trains have more severe speed limits. It takes at least 1 hour and 28 minutes to complete a full run of this route in the 843, sometimes even longer depending on the stopping pattern, and indeed, there's one service that runs for just over 2 hours. Curiously, and if you own the Maintalbahn add-on of November 2023, the Deutsche Bahn BR642 has a timetable mode layer on the Czech route, but in this case, she's only playable for a short passenger service between Turnov and Železný Brod. I forget exactly what this is meant to represent, but in any case, it's a pity that we didn't get a custom reskin for the BR642, since the existing Deutsche Bahn Red looks very out of place in the Czech Republic. As an aside, I have been getting annoyed with the sheer number of times I've seen Dovetail add the BR642 as a timetable mode layer on their German routes, given how out of place the existing Westfrankenbahn variant looks on those routes. Case in point, Schnellfahrstrecke Köln or the Pfälzische Ludwigsbahn. When I first loaded into this route, the frame rates were not as good as I was thinking they would be, although to be fair, there is a lot of scenery detail on this route. At Liberec, the frame rate was hovering around 52 frames per second when I was looking towards the northern end of the station, but then the frame rate virtually halved when I turned around to face the sidings south of the station, and this wasn't a one-off. As for the route's general performance on my end, it averages around 55 to 70 frames per second depending on the scenery density, although it dips to around 35 FPS in other built-up areas outside of Liberec. At one point, I tried playing in guard mode on a short service from Stará Paka to Železný Brod, but found that, initially, there wasn't much to do because the game didn't give me any tickets to check, despite all the people that were on the train when we left Stará Paka, so all I could really do was hit spacebar to whistle to the driver, signalling that it was time to go, then stand around and wait for the next station. After the first intermediate station, whose name escapes me, I was finally given tickets to check, but this begs the question as to why I didn't get any on the initial departure from Stará Paka. In any case, I rarely, if ever, play guard mode because of all the bugs that I've heard about. In this case, the job list was basically the same: signal to the driver, check a couple of tickets and wait for the next stop routine after every station on the run to Železný Brod, and I wasn't given any more tickets to check for the last few station stops. The journey felt rather boring because of how little there was to do. While it's on my mind, I invite people who do play guard mode to leave their thoughts on it in the comments section. As for other issues I experienced while trying out the Czech route and its included rolling stock, for one thing, there seemed to be a bug with the Class 750 introduction tutorial, in the sense that, after getting up to speed, setting the throttle back to idle and coasting along, the brake application objective wouldn't clear even after I moved the lever, so I couldn't complete the tutorial. Meanwhile, I was disappointed to find that there's no fast travel marker for the smaller stations, such as Pilinkov, Sedlejevice, Duby Turnowa, and Lizhny. This gap in the ballast, and an abrupt change in sleeper type between Malá Skala and Lizhny, a switch lever embedded in the platform at Železný Brod, and this weird glitch with an NPC and a suitcase, although this one is pretty tame compared to some of the other NPC bugs I've seen in this game. At one point, I got to Kościołów, the last crossing loop before Stará Paka, and found that I had to stop at a red signal. This was due to two opposing AI trains held at red signals on the western side of Stará Paka, and they had been like that for a long time, but I couldn't see any sign of a problem train that was stopped off-path, which is a major issue that I've seen multiple times in the past. I ended up having to delete the freight train, as much as I didn't want to, but that at least fixed the signals to the point where I could get a clear run for the rest of the journey to Stará Paka. By the time I finally got there, I was 4 minutes late, which is not as much of a delay as what I was initially expecting. And now for some random observations that I made while exploring this route. The general colour palette reminds me of the Niedertalbahn and Mittenwaldbahn. There's an unusual sounding door chime on the 843 and her coaches. A bizarre looking signal, apparently a shunting signal, at Jarmanice and other locations. That church visible on a distant hill near... I'm not even going to try and say this one, so I'll just put it on screen instead. A delightful house by the line side between another one I don't know how to pronounce, and Duby Turnowa. An orchard full of apple trees next to Duby Turnowa station. Half white, half red balls on the power lines for some reason. A tiny model railway diorama at Malá Skala. A nice little shelter at Lizhny station, which kind of reminds me of the concrete shelters that I saw at some stations in England. AI trains blasting their horns where appropriate. You've got tunnel reverb, as should be the standard for all subsequent routes, if they have tunnels of course. And of course, I could not forget to mention the fact that you can walk up to the castle, again another one whose name I can't remember how to pronounce, which is not far up the line from Turdenov station. Vector didn't need to make the castle accessible, but it's kind of neat how they did so anyway. It's just a pity that you can't really do anything up here. I was intrigued by the 843's unusual door layout, featuring a single leaf at one end and double leaf at the other, while her additional coaches only have single leaf doors. The 843's door layout reminds me of the SD, later SRV, cab cars that we've got in New Zealand, which were rebuilt from former British Rail Mark II coaches, and use the same door layout as the 843. All things considered, I have a reasonably high opinion of the Liberec to Stará Paka add-on for TSW6, despite my non-existent knowledge of Czech railways. Although there is still some room for improvement, and the 843 and 750 can be very daunting if you're unfamiliar with them, the overall add-on is still a respectable effort from Vector Simulations, especially given the fact that it's their first route. However, I can understand if people don't like the idea of a rural single-track route with long journey times and a Spartan timetable. As the saying goes, each to their own. In saying that, I would recommend picking up this route if A, you can get it at a discount, and B, you just want something different from the same old UK, US and German stuff, and TSW is sorely lacking where those different routes are concerned. For the price I paid, I think I've got reasonable value for money from the Liberec to Stará Paka route, and I think I'll give it 8 out of 10. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm off to try and forget that Joan Jett's cover of I Love Rock and Roll exists.